A wealthy duke pretends to be a peasant in a forgotten village to find true love, and the most rejected girl proves, through tears, her heart has no price. The dust rose in lazy spirals from the unpaved road leading to the Morales estate as Victor de Alcantara adjusted the worn fabric of his disguise one final time. The coarse wool scratched against skin accustomed to silk, but discomfort had become his chosen companion on this journey towards something real. He had shed his title like an old coat, left behind the marble halls and golden fixtures of his palace, and now stood before wrought iron gates that had seen better days, much like the family name they protected. Gustavo, he whispered to himself, testing the false identity on his tongue. The name felt foreign but liberating, stripped of the weight of expectations and calculated affections that had suffocated him for 26 years. Before he could announce his presence, a sharp crack cut through the afternoon air. Not the sound of a whip, but something worse. Words. Venomous, deliberate words that struck with precision. Useless creature, look at this disaster you've made of the garden. Lucrecia Morales' voice carried across the courtyard like shattered glass. Your very existence is an affront to this family's dignity. Victor peered through the iron bars and felt his chest tighten. A young woman knelt in the dirt, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her face as she gathered scattered flower bulbs with trembling fingers. Her dress, once perhaps a soft blue, was now faded and patched, yet she moved with a grace that seemed almost defiant against her circumstances. I'm sorry, Mother. I'll replant them all. The girl's voice was barely audible, but Victor caught the tremor in it. Not fear, but exhaustion. The kind that came from years of swallowing pride. Mother, the word struck him like a physical blow. This wasn't servant discipline. This was cruelty wrapped in familial authority. Lucrecia Morales circled her daughter like a predator, her silk gown pristine against the girl's humble attire. Sorry doesn't restore what your clumsiness has destroyed. Sorry doesn't erase the shame you bring to our name simply by breathing. Victor's hands tightened on the gate. In his world of calculated courtesies and diplomatic smiles, he had never witnessed such raw brutality disguised as maternal guidance. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, but his mission demanded patience. He was Gustavo now, a poor man seeking work, not a duke with the power to command respect. Perhaps, came a measured male voice, we should focus on solutions rather than dwelling on mistakes. Francisco Morales emerged from the main house, his bearing still proud, despite the threadbare edges of his jacket. His eyes found Victor at the gate with sharp calculation. And you are? Gustavo Herrera, sir. Victor stepped forward, removing his worn cap with practiced humility. I've traveled from the northern provinces seeking work. I heard the Morales family might have need of strong hands and a willing spirit. Francisco's gaze swept over him with the same assessing coldness Victor had endured countless times at court, though for different reasons. Here, he was being evaluated for his usefulness, not his wealth. Can you handle livestock? Mend fences? Work from dawn until dusk without complaint? I can, sir. I ask only for food and shelter in return for honest labor. The kneeling girl, Fatima, he learned from her mother's continued scolding, glanced up briefly. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Victor felt something shift in his chest. Her gaze held no self-pity, only a quiet resilience that seemed to burn from within despite her circumstances. Very well. Francisco gestured toward a weathered building beyond the main house. The quarters above the stable will suffice. You begin tomorrow at first light. As Victor followed Francisco toward his new accommodations, he heard Lucrecia's voice rise again. And you, ungrateful girl, will spend the evenings scrubbing the floors until they shine. Perhaps that will remind you of your proper place in this household. The words followed Victor like shadows as he climbed the narrow stairs to his Spartan room. A single window overlooked the courtyard where Fatima still knelt, now alone, carefully placing each rescued bulb into a basket with the tenderness one might reserve for wounded birds. He watched her work in the fading light, noting how she paused to examine each bulb, discarding only those beyond salvation. There was hope in that gesture, hope that something beautiful might still grow from what others deemed ruined. Victor Dalcanara had come to the Morales estate seeking authenticity, tired of being pursued for his title rather than his heart. He had expected to find simple people living simple lives. Instead, he had discovered something far more complex. A young woman who carried herself with dignity despite being treated as disposable, who tended to broken things with gentle hands while her own spirit was systematically crushed. As night settled over the estate, Victor, now Gustavo, made himself a silent promise. He would learn the truth of this place, understand the dynamics that allowed such cruelty to flourish under the guise of family. But more than that, he would discover what lay beneath Fatima's quiet strength. He had shed his identity to find love without price. He hadn't expected to find someone who might need to be shown that she, too, was worthy of such love. Dawn arrived with the harsh clang of the estate bell, and Victor, now fully committed to his role as Gustavo, descended from his modest quarters to find the Morales household already stirring with calculated energy. The family moved through their morning routines like actors who had long forgotten they were performing, each playing their part in a drama of fated nobility. Ricardo Morales lounged against the breakfast table, his 22 years worn with the particular arrogance of someone who had never known true responsibility. His shirt was clean but wrinkled, his posture slouched with the confidence of inherited privilege, even as that privilege crumbled around him. "So, Father, this peasant is our salvation?" Ricardo's voice dripped with disdain as he gestured toward Victor with a piece of bread. "How wonderfully we've fallen." "Mind your tongue," Francisco replied tersely, though his own discomfort was evident. "Honest work built this estate. There's no shame in employing those who understand its value." Letitia, the eldest daughter at 24, looked up from her correspondence with calculating eyes. Her beauty was undeniable but sharp-edged, like a blade wrapped in silk. "Speaking of honest work, has there been any word from His Excellency? The Duke's visit would solve so many difficulties." Victor's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Even here, disguised as a laborer, he couldn't escape the shadow of his own title. The irony tasted bitter as yesterday's bread. "These things require patience, daughter. Nobility operates on its own schedule." Francisco's words carried the weight of desperate hope dressed as certainty. Renata entered the dining room like a storm cloud, her 19 years sharpened by suspicion and competitive malice. She possessed a cruel intelligence that Victor recognized from court, the kind that found weaknesses and exploited them without conscience. "Where's the little mouse?" she asked sweetly, though nothing about her tone suggested affection. "Surely our dear Fatima hasn't forgotten her morning duties?" "I sent her to the market at first light," Lucretia answered without looking up from her tea. "Someone must ensure we have proper provisions, even if we must rely on common labor." The slight was clearly meant for Victor, but he absorbed it without reaction. He had learned patience in the gilded cages of diplomacy. This rough-hewn cruelty was merely another language to master. Francisco stood abruptly. "Gustavo, come. I'll show you the extent of your responsibilities." They walked through grounds that whispered of former grandeur. Gardens overgrown but still holding traces of careful design. Fences mended with whatever materials could be found. Livestock that looked well-fed despite the family's obvious financial strain. Victor began to understand the precarious balance. Appearances maintained through sheer determination and increasingly desperate measures. "The truth is, Gustavo," Francisco said as they reached the stables, "this estate runs on borrowed time. We've mortgaged everything except our name, and even that." He paused, studying Victor's face. "You seem educated for a farm laborer. Your speech, your posture, where exactly did you say you came from?" Victor had prepared for this question. "My father was a teacher, sir. He believed education was the one inheritance poverty couldn't steal." The lie came smoothly, wrapped around a grain of truth. His father had indeed valued learning, though as a duke rather than a schoolmaster. Francisco nodded slowly. Then you understand the value of discretion. What you see here, what you hear, it remains here. The Morales name has weathered many storms. We'll weather this one as well. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching hooves echoed across the courtyard. Victor turned to see Fatima returning from a market. Her small figure dwarfed by the horse she guided with surprising skill. She moved with an efficiency born of necessity, unloading supplies with practiced movements despite the obvious weight of each bundle. Fatima, Francisco's voice carried a note of resigned authority. Take the provisions to your mother, then return to help Gustavo understand his duties. She nodded silently, but Victor caught the brief flicker of something in her expression. Relief, perhaps, at the prospect of a task that might take her away from the main house and its suffocating atmosphere. As she passed him, carrying a basket nearly as large as herself, their eyes met again. This time, Victor noticed details that yesterday's distance had hidden. The calluses on her hands that spoke of years of labor, the careful mending in her dress that revealed both poverty and pride, the way she held herself as if apologizing for taking up space. She's stronger than she appears, Francisco observed, noting Victor's attention. Unfortunate that strength is wasted on. He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. Victor felt a familiar rage building in his chest. The same fury that had driven him to abandon his comfortable life in search of something real. Here was reality in its cruelest form. A young woman treated as an inconvenience by the very people who should have protected her. Sir, Victor said carefully, perhaps you could explain the family dynamics, so I might better understand my place here. Francisco's laugh was bitter. Dynamics? A pretty word for survival, Gustavo. Fatima is... He paused, choosing his words. She's my daughter, but circumstances have made her position complicated. She serves the household because it's what's needed. Nothing more, nothing less. The euphemisms couldn't disguise the truth. Fatima had been relegated to servant status within her own family, her birthright exchanged for some perceived necessity that Francisco wasn't quite willing to articulate. When she returned, the afternoon light caught the exhaustion in her movements. Yet she approached Victor with the same quiet dignity he had observed the day before. Father says you need guidance with the estate work, she said softly. I can show you the routines, the animals' habits, which tools work best for each task. Her voice was carefully modulated, neither subservient nor familiar, the tone of someone who had learned to navigate dangerous social waters with precision. I would be grateful for your help, Miss Fatima. Something flickered across her face at the respectful address. When was the last time, Victor wondered, that someone had called her Miss instead of simply barking her name like a command? As she led him through the daily responsibilities, Victor began to see the hidden architecture of the estate's survival. Fatima's knowledge was comprehensive, her efficiency remarkable. She knew which cow gave the most milk, which fields needed attention, how to stretch resources without compromising quality. She was, he realized, the invisible foundation upon which the entire Morales household functioned. Yet she moved through these tasks like a ghost in her own life, present but unacknowledged, essential but unwanted. 3 weeks passed like pages in a book Victor had never intended to read, each day revealing new layers of the carefully constructed deception that was the Morales household. By morning, he labored alongside the few remaining servants. By evening, he found himself drawn to conversations that occurred in the shadows between duty and exhaustion. The estate's financial situation had become impossible to ignore. Creditors arrived with increasing frequency, their polite inquiries barely masking growing impatience. Francisco handled each visit with the same strained dignity, promising payments that everyone knew couldn't be made, buying time with words when money had run out. The Duke's fever has persisted, Letitia announced one evening, waving a letter with theatrical despair. His physician advises against travel for at least another month. Victor nearly choked on his simple dinner. His own physician, a man paid handsomely to maintain fiction when necessary, had outdone himself with this particular medical creativity. The irony of being delayed by his own fake illness while living under an assumed name would have been amusing if the consequences weren't so visible in the Morales family's increasingly desperate expressions. Another month? Lucretia's voice cracked with barely controlled panic. The Vargas debt comes due in 3 weeks. Don Leopoldo has been patient, but his patience has limits. Renata's eyes glittered with malicious calculation. Perhaps it's time to consider alternative solutions. Surely the Duke isn't the only nobleman who might appreciate what our family has to offer. The conversation continued around Victor like a dance he recognized from court. The delicate negotiation of desperation dressed in euphemism. They were discussing marriage prospects, dowries, strategic alliances, human currency in the marketplace of survival. Later, as the household settled into evening routines, Victor found himself walking toward the garden where he had first seen Fatima. She was there as he had somehow expected, tending to the bulbs she had rescued weeks ago. In the fading light, he could see green shoots emerging from the soil, life insisting on itself despite circumstances. "They're growing," he observed softly, approaching with the careful respect he would have shown any lady at court. Fatima looked up, startled. In the weeks since his arrival, their interactions had been cordial but distant, professional exchanges about livestock and crops, nothing more. Yet something in the evening air seemed to invite deeper conversation. "I wasn't sure they would survive," she admitted, returning her attention to the tender plants. "Mother said they were ruined, that I should throw them away rather than waste effort on damaged things." The metaphor hung between them, obvious and painful. Victor knelt beside her, studying the careful arrangement of stones she had placed to protect the emerging shoots from harsh winds. "Your mother was wrong," he said simply. "Sometimes the things that survive damage become stronger than those that never faced it." Fatima's hands stilled on the soil. "You speak strangely for a laborer, Gustavo. Your words, they don't match your clothes." Victor felt the familiar tension of maintaining his disguise. Each conversation with Fatima felt like walking a tightrope between truth and necessity. "My father valued learning above wealth. He taught me that wisdom doesn't require fine clothing to flourish." "What was he like?" "Your father." The question came quietly, as if she were afraid of overstepping some invisible boundary. The honest answer would have revealed everything, but Victor found a truth that fit his fiction. He believed that a man's worth came from his actions, not his inheritance. "He died when I was young, but his lessons—" Victor touched one of the protected seedlings gently. "They taught me to see value in things others might overlook." Fatima studied his face in the gathering darkness. "You're not like the other men who have worked here. You listen when people speak. You don't." She paused, searching for words. "You don't look at me as if I'm taking up space that belongs to someone else." The simple statement struck Victor like a physical blow. How thoroughly had this young woman been convinced of her own worthlessness that basic human courtesy seemed remarkable. "Tell me about your dreams," he said impulsively. "When you were younger, before this, what did you imagine for yourself?" Fatima's laugh was soft, but edged with old pain. "Dreams are luxuries, Gustavo. I learned early that wanting things beyond my station only brought disappointment. That's not an answer. That's what someone taught you to believe." Victor's voice carried more authority than Gustavo the laborer should possess, but he couldn't help himself. "What did you dream of when no one was watching?" For a long moment, she was silent. Then, so quietly he had to lean closer to hear, "The sea. I used to dream of seeing the ocean, of standing somewhere so vast that nothing else mattered, not names or positions or who belongs where, just endless possibility." Victor closed his eyes, imagining the young girl who had once dared to dream of horizons beyond this suffocating estate. "Why the sea? I read about it once, in a book from Father's library, before I was forbidden from entering there." She touched one of the seedlings again, her gesture unconsciously protective. The writer described it as democracy of water, where all the rivers eventually become equal, regardless of where they started. The poetry of her words, the depth of thought behind them, confirmed what Victor had begun to suspect. Fatima's intelligence had been deliberately stunted, her education curtailed not from necessity, but from some twisted family dynamic that demanded her diminishment. "You still read," he observed. It wasn't a question. She glanced toward the house, ensuring they weren't observed. "Sometimes, when everyone sleeps, I borrow books from Father's study. I return them before dawn, exactly as I found them." "What are you reading now?" "Philosophy. Kant, mostly. His ideas about human dignity, about worth that exists independent of circumstances." She smiled ruefully. "Perhaps not the most practical choice, but it reminds you that your value isn't determined by how others treat you." Victor finished the thought and saw surprise flicker across her face at his understanding. They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled around them. Victor found himself studying her profile, noting the intelligence in her eyes that no amount of family cruelty could dim, the quiet strength that manifested in small gestures of care, for damaged plants, for the animals she tended, for maintaining hope in impossible circumstances. When she finally rose to return to the house, she paused. "Gustavo, why are you really here?" Not the story about seeking work, the real reason. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victor stood slowly, considering how much truth he could offer without destroying everything. "I was looking for something authentic," he said finally. "Something real in a world that had become entirely artificial. And have you found it?" Their eyes met in the darkness, and Victor felt the weight of all his deceptions pressing against the genuine connection growing between them. "Yes," he whispered, "I think I have." The morning brought chaos wrapped in the mundane ritual of breakfast. Victor descended from his quarters to find the Morales family gathered around the dining table in a state of barely controlled agitation. Letters lay scattered across the polished wood like accusations, each bearing seals that seemed to mock the family's pretensions. "3 more creditors," Francisco announced, his voice hollow with defeat. "The grain merchant, the fabric supplier, and—" He paused, holding up a letter with trembling fingers. "Don Leopoldo Vargas himself. He requests an immediate meeting to discuss alternative arrangements for our debt settlement." Lucretia's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied powder. Alternative arrangements? What could he possibly mean? But Renata's sharp intake of breath suggested she understood perfectly. Victor watched her expression transform from confusion to calculation to something approaching predatory satisfaction. "He means marriage," Renata said quietly. "Don Leopoldo is a widower with substantial holdings, but no social refinement. A union with our family would elevate his status considerably." "Marriage to whom?" Letitia demanded, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer wouldn't favor her. Francisco set down the letter with careful precision, the gesture of a man buying time he didn't have. "The debt is substantial. Any arrangement would need to reflect the magnitude of our obligations." Victor felt ice form in his stomach as the family's unspoken calculations became clear. They were discussing human collateral, weighing their daughters against their debts with the same cold pragmatism they might use to evaluate livestock. "Fatima enters her 20th year next month," Lucretia observed with clinical detachment. "She's serviceable, healthy, accustomed to modest circumstances." The words hit Victor like physical blows. They were discussing Fatima, as if she were property to be transferred, her life a commodity to be bartered away to save the family's reputation. "Has anyone considered consulting Fatima about these arrangements?" The words escaped before Victor could stop them, spoken with an authority that made the entire family turn to stare at him. The silence that followed was dangerous. Francisco's eyes narrowed as he studied Victor with new intensity. "I beg your pardon, Gustavo, but family matters are hardly the concern of hired laborers." Francisco's tone carried warning, but also curiosity. "Though I confess your interest in my daughter's welfare seems unusually developed for someone in your position." Victor forced himself to adopt a more humble posture, though every instinct screamed against the deference. "Forgive me, sir. I only meant that she works harder than anyone on this estate. She deserves consideration." "Consideration?" Renata laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. How wonderfully romantic. The peasant labored, defending the family outcast, like something from a penny novel. But her mockery couldn't quite disguise the suspicion building behind her eyes. Victor realized he had made a mistake. His defense of Fatima had been too passionate, too immediate. In a household where cruelty was currency, compassion marked him as either naive or deceptive. "Where exactly did you say you came from, Gustavo?" Renata continued, her voice silk over steel. "Your accent occasionally slips into something refined. Your hands, while calloused now, show signs of previous softness. And your reaction to our family discussions suggests familiarity with higher stations." Victor felt the walls closing in. Renata possessed the kind of intelligence that thrived on uncovering secrets, and his disguise, effective enough for Francisco's desperate needs, wouldn't withstand sustained scrutiny from someone actively seeking deception. "I told you," he replied carefully. "My father valued education. Perhaps I learned more refined speech from books. Perhaps." But Renata's smile suggested she wasn't convinced. How fascinating that education should instill such protective instincts toward young women in distress. Almost chivalrous. Before Victor could respond, footsteps echoed from the corridor. Fatima appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray of fresh bread from the kitchen. Her entrance effectively ended the interrogation, but Victor caught the way Renata's eyes followed his reaction to Fatima's presence. "Ah, perfect timing," Francisco said with forced brightness. "Fatima, we've been discussing your future. There may be opportunities arising soon that could benefit the entire family." Fatima set down the tray with careful precision, but Victor noticed the slight tremor in her hands. "Opportunities, father?" "Marriage prospects," Lucretia interjected before Francisco could soften the announcement. "Don Leopoldo Vargas has expressed interest in forming a more permanent alliance with our family. The arrangement would resolve certain financial complexities." Victor watched Fatima's face transform as understanding dawned. The careful composure she had maintained for years cracked just slightly, revealing the terror beneath. "Don Leopoldo?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "But his reputation is that of a successful businessman," Francisco said firmly. "Whatever gossip you may have heard about his domestic arrangements is hardly relevant to our situation." But Victor knew exactly what gossip Fatima had heard. Don Leopoldo Vargas was known throughout the region not just for his wealth, but for his treatment of women. Servants dismissed after mysterious accidents, a first wife who had died under circumstances that raised questions never officially investigated. The man was a brute who had learned to hide his cruelty behind social position and financial power. "Father, please." Fatima's composure finally broke. "Surely there must be other solutions. I could work more, eat less, take on additional." "Enough." Francisco's voice cut through her plea like a blade. "This matter is decided. Don Leopoldo will visit tomorrow to finalize arrangements. You will present yourself appropriately and accept whatever terms he offers." Victor's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. Every fiber of his being screamed against this casual destruction of an innocent life. He possessed the power to stop it. One word of his true identity would send Don Leopoldo scurrying away and reduce the family's debts to insignificance. But revealing himself would destroy any chance of understanding whether the growing connection between himself and Fatima was real or merely gratitude dressed as affection. As the family dispersed to their various pursuits, Victor found himself alone with Fatima in the dining room. She stood frozen beside the table, staring at nothing, her entire world having shifted in the span of a conversation. "Fatima," he said softly. She looked up, and Victor saw something die behind her eyes, the last flicker of hope that had sustained her through years of cruelty and neglect. "I should have expected this," she whispered. "I was foolish to hope that my life might belong to me." Victor stepped closer, desperate to offer comfort while constrained by the limitations of his disguise. "This isn't over. There might be other solutions." "What solutions?" Her laugh was bitter, age beyond her years. I have no dowry, no prospects, no value except as payment for my family's mistakes. Don Leopoldo knows this. He can name his terms because I have no choice but to accept them." The resignation in her voice was worse than tears would have been. Victor realized he was witnessing the moment when hope finally surrendered to reality, when a young woman accepted that her dreams of the sea, of endless possibility, would die in the practical brutality of an arranged marriage to a known predator. "There's always a choice," Victor said, though the words felt inadequate against the weight of her circumstances. "Is there?" Fatima met his eyes with devastating directness. "What choice do I have, Gustavo? What choice does any woman have when she's born into the wrong family, the wrong circumstances, the wrong life?" Victor had no answer that wouldn't reveal everything he was hiding. Instead, he watched helplessly as Fatima straightened her shoulders, reassembling the careful composure that had been her armor for so long. "Thank you for your kindness these past weeks," she said formally. "It meant more than you know." As she walked away, Victor understood that he had reached a crossroads. Tomorrow, Don Leopoldo would arrive to claim Fatima like a debt payment, and Victor would have to choose between maintaining his disguise and allowing an innocent woman to be sacrificed for his experiment in authentic love. The choice, when he finally admitted it to himself, had already been made. The night passed like a fever dream for Victor, each hour marked by the weight of impossible decisions. He paced his small quarters above the stable, calculating possibilities and finding each one wanting. Reveal his identity too soon, and he would never know if Fatima could love the man beneath the title. Wait too long, and she would be lost to a monster who saw women as possessions to be broken. Dawn found him hollow-eyed but resolved. If he couldn't offer truth, he could at least offer hope, something tangible to remind Fatima that she was valued beyond the cruel calculations of her family. He spent the morning hours in the woodshed behind the stables, his hands working with surprising skill despite the unfamiliar tools. The Duke's education had included many refinements, but his childhood had been spent in the company of craftsmen who maintained the palace grounds. He remembered their techniques, their patient explanations of how what could be coaxed into beauty with the right touch. The piece emerged slowly under his careful attention, a small wooden frame, no larger than a book, into which he carved waves. Not the ornate decorative swirls that adorned palace furniture, but something simpler. The rolling motion of water, the endless rhythm that had captured Fatima's imagination in her stolen readings. Within the frame, he etched a horizon line where sea met sky, creating a window into the dream she had confessed in the garden. As he worked, Victor found himself thinking of his mother, Dona Arminda, who waited in their distant palace, probably wondering if her son's strange experiment in common living had run its course. She would be horrified to know he was carving trinkets for a servant girl while hiding his identity like a criminal. But for the first time in years, Victor felt his hands creating something meaningful rather than merely signing documents or shaking hands in diplomatic ceremonies. The sun had climbed past midday when he finally finished. The piece was rough by palace standards. No gilding, no precious inlays. But it captured something essential about movement and possibility that all the court artists' elaborate creations had never achieved. He found Fatima in the kitchen garden, mechanically harvesting vegetables with the slow precision of someone whose mind was elsewhere. She looked up as he approached, and Victor saw that the night had aged her. The quiet strength he had admired was still there, but wrapped now in resignation like a shroud. "I made something for you," he said simply, extending the wooden frame. Fatima stared at the gift, as if she had never seen such an object before. Her hands remained motionless at her sides. "What?" The single word carried the weight of years of disappointment. "Because you deserve to know that someone sees your dreams as worthy of preservation," Victor replied. "Because yesterday, when your family was discussing your future, no one mentioned what you might want for yourself." Slowly, carefully, Fatima reached out and took the frame. Her fingers traced the carved waves with a reverence that made Victor's chest tighten. When she found the horizon line, her breath caught. "It's the sea," she whispered. Your sea, the one you described, where all the rivers become equal. For a moment, Fatima's careful composure cracked entirely. Tears gathered in her eyes, though she fought to contain them with the practiced control of someone who had learned that emotions were dangerous luxuries. I've never, she began, then stopped. No one has ever given me a gift. Not in 20 years. I had begun to think that perhaps I was the sort of person who simply wasn't remembered. The admission broke something in Victor's chest. He reached out instinctively to brush away a tear that had escaped her control, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek with infinite gentleness. You are remembered, he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. You are seen, and you are worth far more than they have convinced you to believe. For a suspended moment, they stood frozen in that intimate tableau, his hand on her face, her fingers clutching the wooden frame, both of them balanced on the edge of something that could change everything or destroy what little safety she had left. Then footsteps echoed from the main house, and they sprang apart like co-conspirators caught in the act of treason. Renata appeared around the corner of the kitchen garden, her eyes immediately cataloging the scene with predatory precision. Her gaze fell on the wooden frame in Fatima's hands, then rose to study Victor's face with renewed suspicion. How touching, she said with poisonous sweetness. The hired laborer has been crafting gifts for our little mouse. How unexpected. Fatima clutched the frame closer to her chest, an instinctive gesture of protection that didn't escape Renata's notice. It's nothing, Fatima said quickly. Just a small token of kindness. Oh, but I think it's considerably more than nothing. Renata stepped closer, extending her hand with imperial expectation. Let me see this token of kindness. I'm quite curious about the artistic abilities of our mysterious Gustavo. No, the word escaped Fatima with surprising firmness. It's mine. Renata's eyebrows rose at this unexpected display of defiance. In all their years together, Fatima had never refused a direct command from any family member. The wooden frame had somehow become a line she would not allow to be crossed. Yours. Renata's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. How presumptuous. Have you forgotten your position so completely that you now believe yourself entitled to refuse reasonable requests? It's just a piece of wood, Victor interjected, trying to defuse the situation. Hardly worth such attention. But Renata's focus had sharpened like a blade finding flesh. On the contrary, Gustavo, I think this piece of wood is worth considerable attention. The craftsmanship is remarkable, almost professional. Where exactly did a wandering laborer learn such refined technique? Victor felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in. Every attempt to help Fatima seemed to deepen the trap he had created for them both. Before he could respond, Renata lunged forward and snatched the frame from Fatima's protective grasp. In her haste to examine it more closely, she lost her grip. The wooden frame tumbled to the ground, striking the stone border of the garden with a sharp crack. The sound seemed to echo forever. Victor watched in horror as the delicate carving split along the grain, the waves fracturing, the careful horizon line breaking apart, like hope made visible and then destroyed. Fatima dropped to her knees immediately, gathering the pieces with desperate care, as if the right arrangement might somehow undo the damage. Her hands shook as she tried to fit the fragments together, but the break was too clean, too complete. How clumsy of me, Renata said with theatrical regret that fooled no one. I do hope it wasn't irreplaceable. Victor knelt beside Fatima, his own hands joining hers in the futile attempt at reconstruction. He could see the exact moment when she stopped trying to repair the frame and simply held the pieces, understanding that some things, once broken, could never be made whole again. It doesn't matter, Fatima whispered, but her voice betrayed the lie. It mattered desperately. For a few precious hours, she had possessed something beautiful made just for her, something that acknowledged her dreams as worthy of preservation. Now it lay in fragments, destroyed by the casual cruelty that had shaped her entire life. Of course it matters, Renata continued, her tone now openly malicious. Poor little Fatima, thinking she could have pretty things like a real person. How silly of her to forget that some of us are born for gifts, and others are born to be gifts themselves. The reminder of tomorrow's arrangement with Don Leopoldo hung in the air like a curse. Victor watched Fatima carefully place the broken pieces in her apron pocket, treating even the fragments with a tenderness that made his heart ache. As she stood and walked away without another word, Victor understood that something irreversible had occurred. The gift had been intended to offer hope. Its destruction had instead illustrated the futility of hope in a world designed to crush it. That evening, as the household settled into its routines, Victor made his way to the small chapel that sat at the edge of the estate grounds. He needed time to think, to plan, to find some way to prevent tomorrow's catastrophe without destroying the authenticity he had traveled so far to discover. But as he knelt in the dim candlelight, surrounded by images of saints who had sacrificed everything for love and justice, Victor realized that authentic love might require the ultimate sacrifice of his deception. Tomorrow would bring Don Leopoldo and his cruel bargain. Tonight was all the time Victor had left to decide whether love was worth the price of truth. Don Leopoldo Vargas arrived precisely at noon, his black carriage cutting through the estate grounds like a funeral procession. Victor watched from the stable yard as the man emerged, tall, imposing, with the kind of presence that commanded attention through sheer force of will rather than any natural charisma. His expensive clothing couldn't quite disguise the brutality that seemed to emanate from him like heat from a forge. Francisco greeted their visitor with the desperate enthusiasm of a drowning man offered driftwood. Don Leopoldo, what an honor. Please come inside. We have much to discuss. Victor felt his stomach clench as he observed the careful choreography of negotiation about to unfold. He positioned himself near the stable entrance, close enough to watch the main house while maintaining the pretense of tending to his duties. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, but his disguise held him paralyzed between conscience and deception. Through the tall windows of the drawing room, he could see the family arranged like chess pieces. Francisco and Lucretia flanked their guest with calculated deference, while Leticia and Renata positioned themselves where their beauty might influence the proceedings. Fatima was conspicuously absent, being prepared, no doubt, for presentation like merchandise awaiting inspection. The negotiation stretched through the afternoon with the methodical precision of a business transaction. Victor caught glimpses of documents being exchanged, hands shaken over agreements that reduced a human life to columns of figures. Don Leopoldo's laughter occasionally drifted across the courtyard, a sound that made Victor's skin crawl with its casual confidence. As evening approached, Fatima finally appeared. Victor's breath caught in his throat. She had been dressed in Letitia's cast-off finery, a gown that had once been fashionable but now hung on her slender frame like borrowed dignity. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that emphasized her youth and vulnerability, transforming her into the perfect image of aristocratic innocence available for purchase. But it was her eyes that destroyed Victor's remaining composure. The quiet strength he had learned to admire was gone, replaced by the hollow resignation of someone who had accepted her fate while dying inside. She moved like a sleepwalker through her own nightmare, present but absent, participating in her own destruction with mechanical compliance. Don Leopoldo circled her slowly, appraising her with the same attention he might give to livestock. He lifted her chin with rough fingers, examining her face in the fading light. He commented on her health, her apparent fertility, her tractable demeanor, discussing her attributes as if she were property he was considering acquiring. "She'll do," Victor heard him say with casual finality. "Young enough to be properly trained, old enough to be immediately useful. The debt will be considered settled upon completion of the marriage ceremony." Francisco nodded eagerly. "Naturally, the ceremony can be arranged within the week." "Tomorrow," Don Leopoldo interrupted. "I see no reason to delay. The local priest can perform the service at dawn. Simple is best for these practical arrangements." Victor watched in horror as Fatima's last thread of composure snapped. She swayed slightly, catching herself against the window frame with white knuckles. The speed of the arrangement had clearly caught her unprepared. She had perhaps hoped for a few more days of freedom, a brief postponement of her fate. Tomorrow seems rather hasty, Lucretia ventured, though her tone suggested negotiation rather than genuine concern for her daughter's welfare. I'm a decisive man, Donna Lucretia. When I see something I want, I take it. Don Leopoldo's smile was predatory as his gaze returned to Fatima. Besides, delay only creates opportunities for complications. Better to conclude our business efficiently. As the group prepared to return inside for dinner, Fatima broke away from the gathering. Victor saw her stumble toward the kitchen gardens, her careful composure finally cracking under the weight of her circumstances. Without thinking, he abandoned his post and followed. He found her beside the vegetable plots where they had shared their conversation about dreams and dignity. She was on her knees again, but this time she wasn't tending plants. She was simply collapsed, the elaborate dress pooling around her like spilled water, her hands clutching the broken pieces of his wooden frame that she had carried all day like talismans against despair. Fatima, he whispered, approaching carefully. She looked up with eyes that held no recognition, as if grief had temporarily severed her connection to the world around her. They're loading me into a carriage tomorrow morning, she said with eerie calm. Like baggage, like cargo that needs to be delivered to its proper destination. Victor knelt beside her, his heart breaking at the sight of her complete defeat. This can't happen. There must be some way. What way? Her laugh was hollow, age beyond her 20 years. I have no money, no connections, no power. I'm not even considered family in any meaningful sense, just an inconvenient mouth to feed who can finally be put to useful purpose. You could run, Victor said desperately, knowing even as he spoke that the suggestion was futile. Where? With what resources? Don Leopoldo has influence throughout the region. There's nowhere I could hide that he wouldn't eventually find me. And when he did, she shuddered, clearly having heard the same stories Victor knew about the man's treatment of those who crossed him. Victor stared at her broken form, at the fragments of hope scattered around her like fallen leaves, and felt the last of his rational restraint crumble. The experiment in authentic love had become a torture that he could no longer endure. Tomorrow morning, an innocent woman would be handed over to a predator while he stood by maintaining a deception that had lost all meaning in the face of such cruelty. Fatima, he said quietly, what if I told you that there might be another way? That someone exists who could prevent this marriage, who could ensure your safety and freedom. She looked at him with eyes empty of hope. Then I would say you're either lying to spare my feelings, or you're as naive as I once was about how the world actually works. Victor reached out and took her hands, still clutching the broken wood. Her fingers were ice-cold despite the warm evening air. What if I'm neither lying nor naive? What if there really is someone with the power to stop this? Someone who cares about what happens to you? Something flickered in Fatima's expression. Not hope, exactly, but a kind of desperate curiosity. Who? Who could possibly have such power and also care about the fate of someone like me? Victor felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a mantle. Tomorrow would bring Don Leopoldo's carriage and the ceremony that would destroy everything pure he had discovered in this place. Tonight was his last chance to choose between the safety of deception and the dangerous territory of truth. Someone, he said carefully, who has been closer than you realize. Someone who has seen your worth when your own family couldn't. Someone who would do anything to keep you from harm. Fatima studied his face in the gathering darkness, and Victor saw the exact moment when suspicion began to war with desperate hope in her expression. Gustavo, she whispered, who are you really? The question hung in the evening air like a challenge, like an invitation, like the beginning of either salvation or complete catastrophe. Victor looked into her eyes and prepared to risk everything he had carefully constructed in the hope of saving everything that truly mattered. The words hung between them like a bridge Victor was afraid to cross. In the darkness of the kitchen garden, with Fatima's desperate question echoing in the air, he felt the weight of weeks of deception pressing against his conscience. Tomorrow would bring Don Leopoldo's carriage and a ceremony that would destroy an innocent life. Tonight was his last chance to choose truth over safety. "My name," he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that Gustavo the laborer had never possessed, "is Victor de Alcantara. I am the Duke of Alcantara, heir to the duchy that bears my family name." The silence that followed was profound. Fatima stared at him with the blank expression of someone whose world had just shifted so completely that comprehension required time to catch up with reality. That's impossible," she whispered. "The Duke is ill. He canceled his visit. He's standing in front of you." Victor interrupted gently. "The illness was a fiction created by my physician to buy time. I've been here for weeks, living as Gustavo, working alongside you, learning who you really are." Fatima's hands began to tremble. The broken pieces of the wooden frame fell from her grasp, scattering across the dark soil like fragments of her shattered understanding. "Why?" The single word contained multitudes of pain, confusion, and betrayal. "Why would you? Why would someone like you pretend to be?" Victor reached toward her, but she flinched away from his touch as if his hands carried poison. The gesture cut him more deeply than any diplomatic insult ever had, because I was tired of being pursued for what I possessed rather than who I was. Because I wanted to find someone who could see value in the man beneath the title. Because he paused, searching for words adequate to explain the inexplicable. Because I was looking for authentic love, and I found it here with you. Authentic love? Fatima's voice cracked with bitter laughter. "You call deception authentic? You've been watching me like an experiment, studying the poor, desperate girl who might be grateful enough to love a duke disguised as a peasant." "No." Victor's denial came with desperate intensity. "It wasn't like that. The feelings are real, Fatima. Everything I've felt for you, everything I've learned about your strength and intelligence and worth. None of that was pretense. But the foundation was." She struggled to her feet, the borrowed finery making her movements awkward as she tried to escape his presence. "Everything I trusted, everything I believed about you, about us, it was built on lies." Victor rose as well, following her retreat with careful steps. "The circumstances were false, but the emotions were real. I've watched you tend wounded things with infinite patience. I've seen you sacrifice your own needs for others without complaint. I've listened to you speak of dreams and philosophy with an intelligence that your family refuses to acknowledge. None of that changes because you now know my real name, doesn't it?" Fatima turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Do you understand what you've done to me? For weeks, I allowed myself to believe that someone saw me as worthy of kindness, worthy of conversation, worthy of gifts carved by hand. But it was all charity, amusement, a rich man's experiment in slumming with the peasants." "It was love," Victor said simply. "Imperfect, complicated, wrapped in deception I now regret, but love nonetheless." "Love." Fatima's laugh was raw with pain. "You speak of love while I'm being sold to a monster tomorrow morning? If you truly cared for me, if this love is real, where was it when my family was negotiating my life away like livestock?" The accusation hit Victor like a physical blow because it contained enough truth to draw blood. He had indeed stood by while her fate was decided, constrained by the very deception he now regretted. "You're right," he admitted. "I should have acted sooner. I should have revealed myself the moment they began discussing marriage arrangements. But I was selfish. I wanted to know if what we had could survive the truth of who I am. And now you know." Fatima's voice was hollow with exhaustion. "I can't trust anything I felt for Gustavo, because Gustavo never existed. And I could never trust anything offered by a duke, because how could I know whether it comes from genuine feeling or mere pity for the poor girl who caught his attention during his adventure in authenticity?" Victor felt everything he had hoped to build crumbling around him like a house built on sand. The connection he had cherished, the growing affection he had believed mutual, the possibility of love without artifice. All of it was disintegrating under the weight of his own deception. "Fatima, please. Tomorrow morning, Don Leopoldo will come for you. But I can stop it. I have the power to cancel your family's debts, to ensure your safety, to give you the freedom to choose your own future. With what strings attached? She asked bitterly. What would be the price of the Duke's protection? Marriage to him instead? Gratitude expressed in whatever way he deems appropriate. No strings, Victor said desperately. No expectations. I would ensure your independence, help you find your own path, ask nothing in return except. Except what? Except forgiveness. And perhaps the chance to earn your trust honestly this time. Fatima studied his face in the moonlight, and Victor saw the exact moment when her anger transformed into something worse, indifference. I don't know who you are, she said quietly. Gustavo was kind, thoughtful, someone who listened when I spoke of dreams. The Duke d'Alcantara is a stranger who deceived me for weeks while I share my most private thoughts with someone who didn't exist. I exist, Victor protested. Everything you valued in Gustavo exists in me. Does it? Or are you simply good at becoming whatever people need you to be? She shook her head slowly. I've spent my entire life being manipulated by people who claim to know what was best for me. My family sells me to pay their debts, and you lie to me to satisfy your curiosity about authentic love. How am I supposed to distinguish between different kinds of betrayal? Victor felt the conversation slipping away from him like water through cupped hands. Every attempt to explain seemed to deepen her pain, to reinforce her conviction that their entire relationship had been built on false foundations. What can I do to prove that my feelings are real? He asked quietly. What would it take for you to believe that the man who carved that wooden frame, who talked with you about philosophy and dreams, who fell in love with your strength and intelligence, what would it take to convince you that he was real, regardless of his name or title? Fatima looked down at the scattered fragments of wood at her feet, then back at Victor with eyes that held no hope, only resignation. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know if I'm capable of trusting anyone again, especially someone with the power to destroy my life on a whim. Tomorrow I'll marry Don Leopoldo because I have no choice. Tonight, I'll try to forget that I ever believed someone could see value in me without ulterior motives. As she turned to walk back toward the house, Victor realized that his revelation had accomplished the exact opposite of what he had intended. Instead of offering hope, he had stolen the last of her faith in human goodness. Instead of proving his love, he had convinced her that love itself might be just another word for manipulation. The Duke d'Alcantara had the power to prevent tomorrow's travesty, but Victor the man had just lost the only thing that made that power meaningful. The trust of the woman he had learned to love through deception and might never be able to love honestly. Dawn approached sharp and inevitable. Victor stood at his window, watching darkness surrender to gray light, knowing that in less than 2 hours, Fatima would marry Don Leopoldo. Sleep had been impossible. He had spent the night alternating between fury at his stupidity and desperate attempts to find some solution that wouldn't require imposing his will without regard for her feelings. Hooves on cobblestone announced Don Leopoldo's early arrival. Victor watched him emerge with predatory satisfaction, surveying the estate like a conqueror. Behind him came a priest, a clerk, and 2 guards whose presence suggested he anticipated resistance. Don Leopoldo moved with confidence born of never being denied anything he wanted. Today would be no different. He would claim his prize and return home with a new wife to break at leisure. Victor dressed quickly in his finest clothes and positioned himself to observe the proceedings. Through the drawing room windows, he saw Don Leopoldo examining marriage documents while Francisco hovered anxiously. The girl is satisfactory? Don Leopoldo inquired, discussing livestock rather than a bride. Quite satisfactory, Francisco assured him. Young, healthy, well-trained. She'll cause no trouble. Excellent. Early establishment of proper hierarchy prevents future complications. Victor's hands clenched at the casual cruelty. Don Leopoldo wasn't just acquiring a wife. He was planning her systematic destruction. Footsteps announced Fatima's arrival. She descended in Lucretia's altered wedding gown, white silk emphasizing her fragility. But her expression destroyed him, blank, resigned, already dead behind the eyes. She moved like a sleepwalker, responding to directions with mechanical compliance while retreating to where horror couldn't reach. Don Leopoldo approached with proprietary satisfaction, examining her face in the morning light. "Pretty enough," he pronounced. "This would do nicely." The priest began the ceremony with obvious discomfort, rushing through sacred liturgy transformed into legal formality. Victor felt sick hearing words of love perverted into tools of oppression. "If anyone has cause to object," the priest intoned, "let them speak now or forever hold their peace." The silence stretched. Victor felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge, his entire future pivoting on his next choice. He could remain silent and watch Fatima disappear in his sanctioned abuse, or act and face whatever consequences followed. As he watched Don Leopoldo's possessive grip on Fatima's lifeless hand, Victor realized his choice had been made weeks ago in a garden where a young woman had spoken of dreams and dignity. "I object." Victor's voice rang with quiet authority. Every head turned as he stepped from the shadows. "And you are?" Don Leopoldo's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Someone who cannot watch an innocent woman be sold like property." "This peasant has been making inappropriate advances," Francisco said desperately. "He has no standing here." But Don Leopoldo studied Victor with sharp attention. "Your speech, your bearing, you're no common laborer. Who are you really?" Victor felt walls closing in, but welcomed the exposure. Deception had cost him everything. Perhaps truth might salvage something from the wreckage. "I am Victor d'Alcantara, Duke of Alcantara, and I formally object to this travesty disguised as marriage." The silence was profound. Francisco went white with terror. Lucretia dropped her teacup, porcelain shattering like breaking bones. But Fatima's expression mattered most. Shock and pain in her eyes. Another betrayal from someone who had revealed himself to be other than what he appeared. Don Leopoldo, however, was far from intimidated. If anything, his smile sharpened with anticipation. "How interesting," he said slowly. "The great Duke de Alcantara, playing at being a peasant and developing romantic notions about servants. How quaint." Victor stepped closer, letting his natural authority fill the space between them. "This woman will not be marrying you today or any other day. The debt you claim against the Morales family is hereby settled by my personal guarantee." "Is it?" Don Leopoldo's laugh was cold as winter stone. "And what makes you think I'm interested in your money, your grace? Perhaps I prefer the original arrangement." The challenge was unmistakable. Don Leopoldo had recognized not just Victor's power, but also his emotional investment in the outcome. The man was prepared to turn this into a contest of wills with Fatima as the prize. Victor felt something dangerous and primitive rising in his chest. Not the diplomatic calculation he had been trained to use, but something rawer and more honest. "Because if you don't accept my offer," he said quietly, "you'll discover that some things are worth more than money or social advantage. And some lines, once crossed, lead to consequences that wealth cannot prevent." The threat hung in the air between them, like drawn steel, transforming a wedding ceremony into something far more dangerous. The drawing room had transformed into a battlefield where social conventions warred with raw human emotion. Don Leopoldo's smile held the cold satisfaction of a man who had just recognized an opponent worthy of his cruelest instincts, while Victor's threat lingered in the air like the scent of gunpowder before an explosion. "How fascinating," Don Leopoldo said, his voice silk wrapped around steel. "The noble Duke, threatening violence over a servant girl. One might almost suspect personal involvement beyond mere Christian charity." Victor felt the trap closing around him with mechanical precision. Every word he spoke in Fatima's defense would be used to paint him as either a fool blinded by lust or a hypocrite using his power to claim what he desired under the guise of rescue. "My involvement," Victor replied carefully, "is that of any civilized man who refuses to witness cruelty disguised as commerce." "Cruelty?" Francisco interjected desperately, clearly hoping to salvage something from the wreckage of his carefully laid plans. "Your Grace, surely you misunderstand the situation. This is a legitimate marriage arrangement, blessed by the Church." blessed by a priest who looks like he'd rather be anywhere else, sanctifying a transaction that reduces a human being to currency. Victor's gaze swept across the assembled family members, noting how each avoided his eyes, except for Renata, who watched the proceedings with fascination. "Tell me, Don Francisco, what were your daughter's thoughts on this arrangement? Did anyone consider her wishes in this matter?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, because everyone present knew the answer. Fatima's opinion had never been sought, her consent assumed rather than requested. She stood at the altar like a sacrifice prepared for offering, beautiful and silent and utterly powerless. "A woman's wishes," Don Leopoldo observed with casual brutality, "are shaped by proper guidance from men who understand the world's realities. I'm confident that my bride will learn to appreciate the wisdom of this arrangement." Victor saw Fatima flinch at the possessive certainty in Don Leopoldo's voice, and something cold and violent crystallized in his chest. The diplomatic training that had taught him to resolve conflicts through negotiation and compromise suddenly seemed inadequate to the moral clarity of the moment. "She is not your bride," Victor said quietly. "No." Don Leopoldo's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "The ceremony was proceeding quite smoothly before your dramatic entrance. Perhaps you have some legal basis for your objection? Some prior claim that supersedes a legitimate marriage contract." The question was a masterpiece of manipulation, forcing Victor to choose between revealing his emotional investment in Fatima or admitting he had no legal standing to intervene. Either answer would strengthen Don Leopoldo's position while weakening his own. But as Victor searched for a diplomatic response, Fatima herself broke her silence. "Stop." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried across the room with startling authority. "All of you, please, just stop." Every head turned toward her. She stood at the altar like a figure carved from marble, her wedding dress emphasizing her youth and vulnerability. But her eyes held something that hadn't been there moments before, a flicker of the strength Victor had learned to admire during their conversations in the garden. "You're all discussing my life, as if I'm not here," she continued, her voice gaining power with each word. "Father, you've sold me to settle debts I didn't create. Don Leopoldo, you speak of owning me as if I'm property to be acquired. And you," her gaze found Victor with devastating directness, "you burst in here like a knight from some romantic story, making grand gestures to save a woman who trusted you before she knew you were lying about everything that mattered." The accusation hit Victor like a physical blow, partly because it contained enough truth to draw blood. His intervention, however well-intentioned, was indeed another instance of powerful men making decisions about her life without consulting her wishes. "I want to know," Fatima said, turning to address the room with quiet dignity, "why no one has asked me what I want. Why my thoughts on my own marriage are considered irrelevant by everyone present." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Don Francisco shifted nervously, clearly in use to his daughter asserting any kind of agency. Don Leopoldo's expression hardened with displeasure at this unexpected display of independence. "Well," Fatima pressed when no one answered immediately, "don't you think the bride should have some say in her own wedding?" "My dear girl," Don Leopoldo said with patronizing patience, "marriage is far too important a matter to be left to the romantic fantasies of young women. Practical considerations, financial stability, social position, family obligations, these require mature judgment." "Mature judgment," Fatima repeated slowly. "Like selling your daughter to the highest bidder? Like accepting a husband known throughout the region for his domestic management techniques?" Victor watched in fascination as Fatima transformed before his eyes. The resigned victim who had accepted her fate was being replaced by someone who had found her voice in the face of ultimate crisis. The intelligence he had glimpsed in their private conversations was finally being directed toward her own circumstances rather than abstract philosophy. "You forget yourself," Francisco warned, his voice tight with anxiety. "This arrangement benefits the entire family. Your personal preferences cannot be allowed to jeopardize everyone's welfare." "Cannot be allowed?" Fatima's laugh held no humor. "By whom?" What exactly will you do if I refuse to participate in this ceremony? Lock me in my room? Drag me to the altar by force? The questions were pointed and practical, cutting through the polite fictions that had surrounded her captivity. Victor realized that Fatima was systematically exposing the violence underlying her family's treatment of her, the implicit threats that had kept her compliant for so many years. The law is quite clear on a father's authority over unmarried daughters, Don Leopoldo interjected smoothly. Rebellion against parental judgment is both unnatural and legally meaningless. Perhaps Fatima conceded, but you seem to have forgotten something important in your calculations. She turned to face the priest, who had been watching the proceedings with obvious discomfort. Father Martinez, does church law require the bride's consent for marriage to be valid? Can you perform a ceremony over the objections of either party? The priest shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between social pressure and theological obligation. The church does, that is to say, canonical law requires free consent from both parties. Free consent, Fatima repeated, her voice carrying across the room with bell-like clarity. Not coerced consent, not consent assumed by others. Free consent, freely given. Victor felt his heart stop as he realized what Fatima was doing. She was systematically dismantling the legal and moral foundations of her forced marriage, using her intelligence and education to expose the contradictions in her captor's positions. And I, she continued, turning to look directly at Don Leopoldo with fearless honesty, do not consent to marry you. Not today, not ever. Not under any circumstances. The declaration fell into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of consequence spreading in all directions. Don Leopoldo's carefully controlled expression slipped, revealing the rage simmering beneath his civilized facade. You ungrateful little, he began, but Fatima cut him off with raised hand. No, she said firmly, you will not speak to me that way. I may be powerless in many respects, but I am not voiceless, and I will not be silent while you discuss my future as if my thoughts and feelings are irrelevant. Victor stared at her in admiration and terror, recognizing that Fatima had just crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. She had claimed her own agency in the most public way possible, defying not just her family, but the entire social structure that had kept her imprisoned. But he also knew that such defiance, however morally justified, came with consequences that could destroy her entirely. Don Leopoldo's smile returned, but it was no longer civilized. Oh, spirited, he said softly. I do so enjoy breaking spirited things. Fatima's challenge hung in the air like a funeral bell, marking not just the end of romantic illusions, but the death of possibilities that had never been given the chance to fully bloom. Victor felt each second of his silence as an eternity, each heartbeat like a hammer forging the chains of his own hypocrisy. He began, but the words died in his throat. How could he explain that the love he felt was real, but that the social barriers preventing him from acting on that love were equally real? How could he admit that despite all his revelations about authenticity, he was still a prisoner of the conventions he had been born to perpetuate? Don Leopoldo savored the silence like fine wine. How eloquent, Your Excellency. Your hesitation speaks more clearly than any speech about the nature of your feelings. Fatima watched Victor with an expression that slowly evolved from desperate hope to something far more dangerous, final understanding. She had asked the ultimate question, forced him to choose between his words and his actions, and found him wanting. Fatima, Victor tried once more. You must understand that there are considerations. Considerations, she repeated, her voice carrying a bitterness that aged her 20 years into decades. There are always considerations when it comes to maintaining privilege, aren't there? Considerations about what is appropriate, what is expected, what keeps the world functioning the way it always has. Francisco, sensing that the situation was spiraling completely beyond his control, attempted to intervene. Perhaps we should all calm down and discuss this rationally. Rationally? Fatima turned to her father with a cold fury that made him instinctively step back. Like the rational discussion you had when you decided my fate without my participation, like the rational consideration that transformed me into currency for your debts. Fatima, please, Lucretia pleaded, you're behaving inappropriately. Inappropriately. The word left Fatima's lips like a curse. 20 years of hearing about my inappropriate behavior, about how my existence was inappropriate, my education inappropriate, my aspirations inappropriate. She looked around the drawing room, meeting each face in turn. But we never questioned whether your behavior was appropriate, did we? Renata, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke with distilled venom. How dramatic you become, dear sister. All this theatricality won't change the basic facts of your situation. The basic facts, Fatima repeated slowly. Yes, let's talk about the basic facts. She walked to the window, contemplating the gardens where so many illusions had bloomed and died. The basic fact is that I was born a woman in a family that sees me as a burden. The basic fact is that I was educated enough to understand my situation, but not enough to escape it. The basic fact is that two powerful men are deciding my destiny, and neither of them truly sees me as a person. Victor felt each word like a blade. That's not true. I see you. You see what? Fatima confronted him with courage born of total desperation. A romantic fantasy? An interesting break from your ducal responsibilities? An experiment in authenticity that you can abandon when it becomes inconvenient. I see someone extraordinary, Victor said with an intensity that surprised even himself. I see intelligence wasted, kindness unrecognized, strength ignored by everyone around you. I see a woman who deserves far more than this world is willing to offer, but not enough to challenge that world for her, Don Leopoldo observed with cruel satisfaction. Not enough to sacrifice privilege for principles. The accusation hit its target with devastating precision. Victor realized he was being dissected by a man who understood perfectly the limitations of privilege, how it could buy almost everything, but couldn't buy the courage to transcend one's own boundaries. Fatima closed her eyes for a moment, and when she reopened them, something essential had changed. The last spark of hope had been extinguished, replaced by a terrible resolution. Very well, she said with a calm that made everyone in the room shiver. Since no one seems interested in what I actually want, I'll make the decision for all of you. She walked to where Don Leopoldo stood, stopping before him with the dignity of a queen going to the scaffold. Sir, she said formally, I accept your marriage proposal. The silence that followed was deafening. Victor felt the world disintegrating around him as he processed what he had just heard. Fatima had chosen the monster over uncertainty, known brutality over hypocrisy disguised as salvation. Fatima, no, he managed to whisper, but she ignored him completely. There are, however, she continued addressing Don Leopoldo, conditions I must establish. Don Leopoldo arched an eyebrow, clearly amused by the idea that his property might attempt to negotiate terms. Conditions? A proper ceremony, not this rushed farce. I want time to prepare appropriately for marriage. 1 week at minimum. Her voice remained steady despite the tears beginning to form in her eyes. And I want it publicly recorded that I enter this marriage by my own choice, not under coercion. Interesting, Don Leopoldo murmured. And why are these conditions important to you? Fatima smiled, and it was the saddest expression Victor had ever seen on a human face. Because if I'm going to sacrifice my life, I want it to be clear that it was my decision. I want everyone to know that I chose my own destiny, even if that destiny is terrible. The answer revealed the strategy behind her capitulation. Fatima was transforming her own destruction into an act of agency, reclaiming some measure of control over circumstances she couldn't alter. Victor understood that he had lost more than the woman he loved. He had lost the chance to prove that love could transcend the barriers society had erected. His silence in the face of her challenge had been a choice, and that choice had condemned them both to lives defined by limitations they hadn't had the courage to defy. Don Leopoldo considered Fatima's conditions with the patience of a man who knew he had won. Very well. 1 week for preparations, proper ceremony, public records of consent. I can be generous with such a cooperative bride. As the details of the marriage were discussed around her, Fatima remained silent, her hands folded before her like a well-behaved child. But Victor could see the truth in her eyes. She had died inside, sacrificing her soul to protect what remained of her dignity. And he, the man who had come seeking authentic love, had discovered that when confronted with the real price of authenticity, he had been unable to pay it. The priest, Father Martinez, cleared his throat uncomfortably. If I may, the church requires certain formalities for a valid marriage. There must be proper bans posted, time for any legitimate objections to be raised. Father, Don Leopoldo's voice carried a warning that made the elderly priest visibly tremble. I'm sure the church's requirements can be expedited given the circumstances. After all, we wouldn't want bureaucratic delays to interfere with such a joyous occasion. Victor watched this exchange with growing horror, realizing that even Fatima's small victory in securing a week's delay was being undermined by Don Leopoldo's influence and the family's complicity. The man had the power to bend even religious law to his will. Of course, Father Martinez stammered. I'm sure arrangements can be made. Excellent. Don Leopoldo turned back to Fatima with predatory satisfaction. Then we are agreed. 1 week from today, you will become my wife. I trust you will use this time to prepare yourself for your new responsibilities. The threat implicit in his words made everyone in the room uncomfortable except Renata, who watched her sister's destruction with barely concealed glee. Victor felt his hands clench into fists, every instinct screaming at him to act, to fight, to do something other than stand by while an innocent woman was handed over to a monster. But what could he do? Challenge Don Leopoldo to a duel? Use his political influence to interfere in a legal marriage contract? Kidnap Fatima and face the consequences of such a scandal? Each option seemed to lead to disaster. And in his paralysis, Victor realized he was proving Fatima's point about the limitations of his love. When the moment came to risk everything for her, he found himself calculating consequences instead of acting on principle. I believe our business is concluded for now, Don Leopoldo announced, clearly savoring his victory. I'll return in 1 week to collect my bride. In the meantime, I trust the family will ensure she remains available for our wedding. As he prepared to leave, Don Leopoldo paused beside Victor with a smile that was pure malice. Your Excellency, it's been educational meeting you. I hope your experiment in common life has provided the insights you were seeking. Victor met his gaze without flinching, though every word felt like a poisoned dart. Indeed it has. Good. Perhaps you'll think of this conversation when you return to your proper social circle. Some lessons are worth remembering. After Don Leopoldo's departure, the family dispersed with the awkward relief of people who had survived a natural disaster. Francisco retreated to his study to drink away his shame. Lucretia busied herself with wedding preparations, and Renata disappeared with the satisfaction of someone whose plans had succeeded beyond expectation. Victor found himself alone in the drawing room with Fatima, who stood by the window, staring out at the gardens where they had shared so many conversations that now seemed tainted by his deception. Fatima, he said quietly, approaching her with the caution he might show a wounded animal. There has to be another way. I can't let this happen. She didn't turn around. Can't you? You've had every opportunity to prevent it, and yet here we are. I was wrong to hesitate. I was a coward when you needed me to be brave. Yes, she agreed with devastating simplicity. You were. The acknowledgement hung between them like a chasm that could never be bridged. Victor had finally found the authentic emotion he had been seeking, the authentic pain of knowing he had failed the test that mattered most. The week that followed moved with the inexorable pace of an approaching execution. Victor found himself trapped in a hell of his own making, watching the woman he loved prepare for a marriage that would destroy her, while he remained paralyzed by the very social conventions he had once sought to escape. Each day brought fresh preparations for the wedding. Seamstresses arrived to alter Lucretia's old gown. Flowers were ordered, invitations sent to the handful of local families whose attendance would lend legitimacy to what everyone knew was a transaction disguised as a sacrament. The household bustled with activity that felt obscene in its cheerfulness, a celebration of sacrifice wrapped in white silk and orange blossoms. Victor maintained his disguise as Gustavo, though the pretense now felt like torture rather than adventure. He worked in the gardens where he and Fatima had shared their deepest conversations, each familiar spot a monument to possibilities that had withered under the weight of his own cowardice. Fatima moved through the preparations like a ghost haunting her own funeral. She submitted to fittings with mechanical compliance, approved arrangements with empty politeness, and spoke to no one unless directly addressed. The vibrant woman who had discussed philosophy and dreams had retreated so far into herself that Victor wondered if she would ever find her way back. On the third day, as Victor pruned roses in the early morning light, he became aware of someone watching him. He looked up to find Fatima standing at the garden gate, dressed in the same simple blue dress she had worn the night they first spoke of authentic connection. "May I walk with you?" she asked with formal politeness, as if he were truly nothing more than a servant she was addressing with unusual courtesy. Victor set down his shears and nodded, not trusting his voice. They walked in silence through the paths they had traversed so many times before, but everything felt different now. Poisoned by truth, shadowed by consequences that neither had been able to prevent. "I want you to know," Fatima said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "that I don't hate you." The words hit Victor harder than anger would have. "Perhaps you should. Perhaps. But hate requires energy I no longer possess." She paused beside the fountain where she had once spoken of water's democracy, staring into its clear depths. "I've been thinking about authenticity, the thing you came here seeking." Victor waited, afraid that any response might shatter the fragile moment. "I realize that you found it," she continued. "Not the romantic authenticity you were looking for, but something more fundamental. You discovered who you really are when faced with a choice that matters." "And who am I?" Victor asked, though he feared the answer. "Someone who wants to be better than he is, but lacks the courage to pay the price of transformation." Her assessment was delivered without cruelty, which somehow made it more devastating. "Someone who can love genuinely, but only within the boundaries of what's socially acceptable." Victor felt each word like a surgeon's knife, cutting away the illusions he had maintained about his own character. "I failed you." "Yes," she agreed simply. "But perhaps that failure taught you something valuable about the difference between wanting to be noble and actually being noble when it costs everything you've been taught to value." They continued walking, their footsteps the only sound in the garden's morning stillness. Victor wrestled with the urge to touch her, to offer some gesture of comfort that might bridge the chasm his choices had created between them. "What will you do?" he asked finally. After you're married?" Fatima's smile was ghost pale in the early light. "I'll survive. I'll find ways to protect whatever part of myself can be protected. And perhaps, if I'm very lucky and very clever, I'll find small opportunities to help others avoid my fate." The quiet dignity of her response humbled Victor completely. Even facing destruction, she was thinking of others, planning not for escape, but for whatever good she might accomplish within the constraints of her prison. "There has to be another way," he said desperately. "I could." "What?" "Kidnap me and face scandal that would destroy both our lives? Challenge Don Leopoldo to a duel and risk leaving me even more vulnerable? Offer marriage now, when we both know it would be motivated by guilt rather than love?" She shook her head sadly. "The time for heroic gestures has passed, Victor. Now we must all live with the consequences of our choices." The use of his real name startled him. It was the first time she had acknowledged his true identity since the night of revelations. "I do love you," he said, the words torn from him like a confession under torture. "Whatever you think of my actions, whatever cowardice I've shown, that love is real." "I know," she replied, and her gentleness was more painful than anger could have been. "And I believe that in some other world, where birth and circumstances were different, that love might have been enough. But we live in this world, with its rules and barriers and prices, and love alone cannot transcend everything. They had reached the end of their circuit, arriving back at the garden gate where their walk had begun. Victor felt the weight of finality in the moment. This might be their last private conversation, their last chance to speak honestly without the performance that would be required once she became Don Leopoldo's wife. "Will you remember this?" he asked. "Us here before everything changed." Fatima looked at him with eyes that held depths of sadness he couldn't fathom. "I'll remember a man who made me feel, for a brief time, that I might be worth more than the world told me I was. I'll remember conversations that made me think, gifts carved with care, moments when someone listened as if my thoughts mattered. But will you remember it kindly?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'll remember it as a beautiful dream interrupted by waking. And perhaps that's enough, to have had the dream at all, even knowing it couldn't last." As she turned to go, Victor caught her hand, the first time he had touched her since the night of his revelation. Her skin was cold, and he felt her slight tremor at the contact. "Fatima," he said urgently, "if circumstances change, if there's ever an opportunity—" "Don't," she interrupted gently. "Don't make promises we both know you can't keep. Don't give me hope that would only make what's coming harder to bear." She pulled her hand free and walked away, leaving Victor alone in the garden where their story had begun and where, he now understood, it would end. That evening, as Victor sat in his small room contemplating the wreckage of his noble experiment, he heard a soft knock at his door. He opened it to find not Fatima, as his heart had hoped, but Renata, dressed in traveling clothes and carrying a small valise. "I'm leaving tonight," she announced without preamble. "Before the wedding. I wanted to speak with you first." Victor stepped aside to let her enter, curious about what Renata might want to say in what appeared to be their final conversation. "I suppose you think me cruel," she began, settling herself in the room's single chair with elegant precision. "I think you're protecting yourself in the only way you know how," Victor replied carefully. "How diplomatic of you, Your Grace. But we both know the truth. I orchestrated this entire catastrophe because I couldn't bear to watch my sister succeed where I had failed." The admission hung between them with surprising honesty. Victor had expected deflection, justification, anything but this direct acknowledgement of malice. "Where will you go?" he asked. "I have an aunt in Madrid who has agreed to sponsor my entry into society there. Away from this place, away from memories of being the daughter no one wanted." She smiled with bitter self-awareness. "Perhaps I'll find my own duke to deceive me with false promises." "Renata, don't pity me, Your Grace. I made my choices with full knowledge of their consequences. I destroyed my sister's chance at happiness because I couldn't bear her having what I wanted. At least I'm honest about my cruelty." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "You know, if you had acted differently, if you had been brave enough to claim her openly, I might have failed. My schemes only worked because you weren't willing to pay the price of defying convention." The parting shot found its mark with surgical precision. After Renata left, Victor sat alone in the darkness, understanding that he was not the only one whose character had been revealed by crisis. The difference was that Renata owned her failings while he had hidden behind noble intentions and romantic ideals. Tomorrow would bring the final act of a tragedy that multiple people had authored through their choices, their fears, and their refusal to risk everything for what they claimed to value most. Victor closed his eyes and tried to imagine a different ending, but found that his imagination, like his courage, had limits that reality refused to transcend. The wedding day dawned gray and cold, as if nature itself recoiled from the ceremony about to take place. Victor stood at his window, watching the pre-dawn preparations, servants scurrying about with flowers and decorations that would transform the estate's chapel into a stage for sanctified brutality. He had not slept. The night had been spent in restless contemplation of actions he might still take, scenarios he might engineer to prevent the disaster unfolding with mechanical inevitability. Each possibility had crumbled under examination. Kidnapping would destroy them both. A duel would likely leave Fatima even more vulnerable, and a last-minute marriage proposal would be rightfully seen as guilt-driven desperation rather than genuine love. By sunrise, Victor had reached a terrible clarity. He would witness Fatima's sacrifice because he lacked the courage to prevent it, and he would carry that failure for the rest of his life as penance for discovering that his love, however real, was bounded by the very conventions he had once sought to transcend. The morning brought a steady stream of carriages as local families arrived for the ceremony. These were people who had known the Morales family for generations, who understood exactly what kind of transaction they were witnessing, but who would participate in the fiction of celebration because social stability required such performances. Victor dressed carefully in his finest clothes, not the palace finery that would proclaim his ducal status, but the best garments his disguise allowed. If he was going to watch the woman he loved be sacrificed to preserve social order, he would do so honestly, as the man who had failed her rather than the duke whose intervention might have saved her. As he made his way toward the chapel, Victor encountered Francisco emerging from his study with the hollow-eyed look of a man who had spent the night drowning his conscience in brandy. The older man seemed startled to see him, as if he had forgotten that Gustavo still existed in the midst of the day's more pressing concerns. "Ah, there you are," Francisco said with forced cheer that fooled no one. "I trust you'll be attending the ceremony? It's quite an occasion, my daughter marrying into one of the region's most prominent families." Victor studied the man's face, seeing the fear beneath the bluster, the guilt beneath the celebration. "Indeed it is, Don Francisco. Quite an occasion." Something in Victor's tone made Francisco flinch, a flicker of recognition that his employee, whatever his true identity, was not fooled by the performance of paternal joy. "She'll be well cared for," Francisco said defensively. "Don Leopoldo is a man of substance, able to provide for her in ways this family cannot." "I'm sure he is," Victor replied with quiet irony that made Francisco look away uncomfortably. The chapel was filling with guests when Victor arrived, taking a position near the back where he could observe without drawing attention. The altar had been decorated with white roses and orange blossoms, their beauty a mockery of the ugliness about to be sanctified within these sacred walls. Don Leopoldo stood at the altar with predatory satisfaction, dressed in his finest clothes and wearing the expression of a man claiming a long-awaited prize. Beside him, Father Martinez shuffled through his preparations with obvious discomfort, a man of God forced to participate in what everyone knew violated the spirit, if not the letter of Christian marriage. The guests whispered among themselves with the excited energy that surrounded any social drama, their conversations a mixture of genuine congratulations and barely concealed gossip about the hasty nature of the arrangements. Victor caught fragments of their discussions. Speculation about the bride's feelings, commentary on the groom's reputation, observations about the family's financial difficulties that had necessitated such an advantageous match. A stir near the chapel entrance announced the arrival of the bridal party. Lucretia entered first, dressed in her finest gown and wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, followed by two young cousins serving as bridesmaids. They moved with rehearsed precision toward the altar, their steps marking time toward an irreversible conclusion. Then Fatima appeared in the doorway, and Victor felt his breath catch in his throat. She was devastatingly beautiful in the altered wedding gown, the white silk emphasizing her youth and fragility while the veil partially concealed her expression. But Victor could see what others missed. The terrible stillness in her posture, the way she moved like someone walking in a dream, the carefully blank expression that masked her inner devastation. Francisco offered his arm to escort his daughter down the aisle, and Victor watched this final act of paternal betrayal with sick fascination. The man was literally delivering his child to a monster, wrapping the transaction in ceremony and tradition to make it palatable to his conscience. As they began their slow procession toward the altar, Fatima's gaze swept across the assembled guests with mechanical courtesy. For a moment, her eyes found Victor's across the crowded chapel, and in that brief contact he saw everything: her resignation, her pain, her forgiveness, and her final goodbye. The look lasted only seconds, but in it Victor read his own epitaph as clearly as if it were carved in stone. He had had the chance to be her salvation and had chosen instead to be another witness to her destruction. Whatever nobility he had imagined in his character had been revealed as mere pretension when tested against reality's demands. Father Martinez began the ceremony with obvious reluctance, his voice barely audible as he recited words that should celebrate love, but instead sanctified ownership. The familiar phrases, love, honor, cherish, until death do us part, became instruments of torture when spoken over two people where only one had any choice in the matter. Dearly beloved, the priest intoned, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Fatima Elena Morales and Don Leopoldo Sebastián de Varga in holy matrimony. Victor closed his eyes, unable to watch as the woman he loved was bound by sacred vows to a man who would treat her as property rather than partner. The ceremony continued around him like a nightmare from which he couldn't wake, each ritual step bringing Fatima closer to a fate that would destroy everything beautiful and intelligent about her. If anyone has cause to object to this union, Father Martinez said with weary resignation, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The silence stretched endlessly. Victor felt every eye in the chapel waiting, wondering if anyone would be brave enough to voice what everyone knew, that this was wrong, that no amount of legal contract or financial necessity could make it right. His throat worked soundlessly, his hands clenched into fists, his entire body tensed with the desire to act, to speak, to do something other than bear witness to atrocity disguised as sacrament. But the moment passed, and with it his final chance to prove that love could transcend the barriers society had erected. The silence became permanent, and Victor understood that he would carry it with him for the rest of his life. Then, by the power vested in me, Father Martinez continued with funeral solemnity, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Don Leopoldo lifted Fatima's veil with the triumphant care of someone unwrapping a purchased gift, then kissed her with possessive satisfaction while she stood motionless as marble. The congregation applauded politely, their approval the final seal on a transaction that had transformed a person into property. As the newly married couple turned to face their guests, Victor saw Fatima's face clearly for the first time since the ceremony began. Her expression was serene, peaceful almost, with the terrible calm of someone who had surrendered completely to circumstances beyond their control. She was no longer the woman he had fallen in love with. That woman had died during the ceremony, sacrificed on the altar of social convention and masculine cowardice. What remained was a beautiful shell that would perform the role of wife, while the essential self retreated to whatever sanctuary it could find. Victor slipped out of the chapel as the wedding party began their recessional, unable to witness the celebration that would follow. He walked blindly through the estate grounds, past the gardens where he had discovered both love and the limits of his own courage. Behind him, the sounds of festivity began. Music and laughter and congratulations that marked the successful conclusion of a business transaction. Ahead of him stretched a future defined by the knowledge that when called upon to prove his love through action rather than words, he had chosen safety over sacrifice. The Duke of Alcanara would return to his proper life, his experiment in authenticity complete. But Victor the man would remain forever in this garden, watching the woman he loved walk toward her destruction while he stood paralyzed by the very conventions he had come here to escape. The wedding feast proceeded with the hollow gaiety of a celebration over a grave. Victor remained in the gardens, unable to bear the sounds of forced merriment that drifted from the main house. He sat beside the fountain where he and Fatima had first spoken of authentic connection, the irony of the location not lost on him. He had found authenticity, but not the kind he had sought, the authentic pain of recognizing his own moral cowardice when it mattered most. As evening approached, carriages began departing, taking with them the witnesses to his sanctioned crime. Victor watched from his window as Don Leopoldo's ornate coach appeared in the courtyard, ready to transport the new bride to her prison. The sight of it made his stomach clench with nausea. Fatima emerged from the house wearing a traveling dress, her wedding gown already abandoned like the last vestige of her former self. She moved with mechanical precision, her face a mask of polite compliance that revealed nothing of the woman beneath. Don Leopoldo followed, possessive and triumphant, his hand on her arm, both protective and proprietary. Francisco and Lucretia stood on the front steps offering final benedictions. Their relief at the successful completion of their transaction barely concealed beneath parental sentiment. They had sold their daughter to solve their financial problems and would sleep easier knowing their debts were settled, regardless of the human cost. As the coach prepared to depart, Fatima's gaze swept across the estate grounds one final time. Victor pressed himself against his window, hoping for one last connection, one final acknowledgement of what had existed between them. But her eyes passed over his window without recognition, and he realized that she had already begun the process of forgetting everything that would make her new life unbearable to remember. The coach rolled away into the gathering darkness, taking with it the woman Victor had loved and leaving behind only the ghost of possibilities that would haunt him forever. He watched until the vehicle disappeared completely, then sank into his chair with a weight of finality crushing his chest. A soft knock at his door interrupted his grief. He opened it to find Francisco standing in the hallway, clearly intoxicated but attempting to maintain his dignity. "Gustavo," the older man said with elaborate courtesy, "I wanted to thank you for your service to our family during these challenging times." Victor studied Francisco's face, seeing the guilt the man was trying to drown in alcohol and social convention. "It was my pleasure to serve, Don Francisco." "Yes, well." Francisco shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with something he wanted to say. "I thought you should know that your employment here will be ending soon. With the new arrangements, we'll be restructuring the household staff." The dismissal was expected, but it carried symbolic weight that both men understood. Victor represented a witness to the family's shame, a reminder of events they would prefer to forget. His presence would make it difficult to maintain the fiction that everything had been handled appropriately. "I understand," Victor replied quietly. "When would you like me to leave?" "Tomorrow would be convenient." Francisco couldn't meet his eyes as he spoke. "Of course, you'll receive full compensation for your service, and I'd be happy to provide references for future employment." The offer of references was almost laughable. What could Francisco say? That his former employee was reliable, discreet, and possessed of an unfortunate tendency to fall in love with doomed women? That he could be trusted to watch injustice unfold without interfering? That's very generous, Don Francisco. I'll prepare for departure in the morning. Francisco lingered in the doorway, clearly wanting to say more, but lacking the courage or sobriety to find the words. Finally, he mumbled something about early departures and stumbled back toward his study, leaving Victor alone with the wreckage of his experiment in authentic living. That night, Victor packed his few belongings with mechanical precision, each item a reminder of a life he had briefly lived as a simple man seeking genuine connection. The books he had read in this room, the clothes he had worn while working in the gardens, the small gifts he had carved for Fatima but never given. All would be left behind as artifacts of a dream that had ended in nightmare. As dawn broke over the estate, Victor made his final preparations for departure. He had already arranged for his coach to meet him at the village inn, maintaining his disguise until the very end. There would be no dramatic revelation of his true identity, no final confrontation with a family that had unwittingly hosted a duke in their midst. He would leave as Gustavo the gardener and resume his life as the Duke of Alcantara, carrying with him the knowledge of what he had learned about himself in this place. Before leaving, he walked through the gardens one last time, touching the plants he had tended, remembering conversations that had changed him irrevocably. At the fountain, he left a final gift, a small wooden carving of a bird in flight, its wings spread wide as it soared above earthly constraints. He placed it where Fatima would have found it if she had been free to walk these paths again. The carving bore no signature, but she would have known who made it and what it meant, a symbol of the freedom he had failed to give her, but which he hoped she might someday claim for herself. As Victor walked toward the main house to make his formal departure, he encountered the remaining household staff going about their morning duties. They treated him with the casual friendliness of equals, unaware that they were bidding farewell to one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Their genuine warmth contrasted sharply with the hollow courtesy he would soon resume receiving as his due. "Leaving us, Gustavo?" asked Maria, the cook who had often shared her meals and gossip with him. "It won't be the same without you in the gardens." "Life moves us all in different directions," Victor replied, surprised by how much their simple friendship had meant to him. "Thank you for your kindness during my time here." Francisco appeared to oversee his departure, maintaining the fiction of employer and employee until the very end. He handed Victor an envelope containing his final wages and a brief letter of recommendation, then shook his hand with formal politeness that couldn't quite mask his relief at removing a troublesome reminder. As Victor walked down the estate's main drive, carrying a simple traveling bag that contained all his worldly possessions as Gustavo the gardener, he felt the weight of transformation settling over him like a mantle. He was returning to his title, his wealth, his position, but he was not the same man who had left those privileges behind months ago. He had sought authentic connection and found it, only to discover that authenticity included the authentic revelation of his own limitations. He had loved genuinely for perhaps the first time in his life, but that love had been bounded by fears and conventions he had lacked the courage to transcend. At the village inn, his ducal coach waited with its familiar coat of arms and liveried servants. The sight of it seemed to belong to another world, a reminder of the artificial constraints he was about to resume. His driver and footmen greeted him with the elaborate deference due his station, their behavior a stark contrast to the easy camaraderie he had known as a working man. As the coach began its journey back to the capital, Victor looked out the window at the countryside where he had discovered both love and loss. Somewhere in the distance, Fatima was beginning her new life as Don Leopoldo's wife, adapting to constraints that would test every aspect of her intelligence and strength. He had failed to save her, but perhaps his failure had taught him something valuable about the difference between romantic gestures and genuine courage. Perhaps the knowledge of what he had lost would guide him toward better choices in whatever future awaited him. The coach rolled on through the morning light, carrying the Duke of Alcantara back to his proper world while leaving behind a small estate guarding the ghost of a gardener named Gustavo, who had loved a woman named Fatima and learned that love alone, however authentic, was not always enough to overcome the barriers that society and cowardice erected between human hearts. The Duke of Alcantara's palace had never seemed more magnificent or more empty. Victor stood in his private study, surrounded by the trappings of power that now felt like inadequate compensation for what he had lost. 5 years had passed since his return from the countryside, 5 years during which he had fulfilled his ducal obligations with mechanical precision while carrying the weight of his failure like a stone in his chest. He had never married. The memory of authentic connection had ruined him for the strategic alliances that defined aristocratic marriage. His philanthropic work had expanded dramatically, as if charitable acts might serve as penance for his moral cowardice. On this particular afternoon, his secretary announced an unexpected visitor concerning the Morales estate matter from several years ago. The woman who entered his study was elegant, well-dressed, and entirely unfamiliar to him. She moved with confident grace, her dark hair streaked with premature silver, her intelligent eyes calm and assessing. "Your Grace," she said with a slight curtsy, "I am Elena Morales, though I use the name Elena Vargas professionally now." Victor stared in shock. This poised woman bore only slight resemblance to the broken girl he had last seen being carried away in Don Leopoldo's carriage. "Fatima," he breathed. "I prefer Elena now," she corrected gently. "Fatima died on her wedding day. Elena was born from her ashes. How are you here? How are you free?" Elena settled herself with practiced grace. "Don Leopoldo died 3 years ago. A riding accident. His nephew had no interest in maintaining an unwilling widow. I was granted my freedom along with a modest settlement." Relief flooded through Victor, followed by shame that he had done nothing to help her achieve that freedom. Why have you come to see me? I wanted you to know what became of the woman you once loved. I wanted you to understand that your failure to save me wasn't the end of my story. Elena described her transformation from victim to survivor. Those 3 years of marriage were hell, but they taught me things about myself I might never have learned otherwise. I discovered I could endure more than I thought possible. I learned to preserve some essential part of myself, even under constant surveillance. And I began to plan. She had used those years to study her captor, convincing him she was broken while secretly preparing for freedom. When he died, I was ready. Within 6 months, I had moved to Madrid and begun a new life. What kind of life? I run a school for young women, Elena replied with quiet pride. Real education, literature, mathematics, philosophy. I teach them to think, to question, to recognize their own worth. And for those who need it, I provide assistance in escaping situations like the one I endured. Victor felt admiration mixed with renewed shame. While he had wallowed in guilt, she had channeled suffering into purpose. Can you ever forgive me? For being too cowardly to act when you needed me to? I forgave you long ago, Victor. Not because what you did was right, but because holding on to anger would have poisoned whatever peace I managed to build. She paused. You gave me something precious. Those conversations where someone treated me as if my thoughts mattered. In my darkest moments, I held on to those memories. I've never stopped loving you, Victor whispered. I know, but the woman you loved couldn't have survived what I endured. She had to die so that I could live. Elena stood, preparing to leave. We're different people now than we were in that garden. You're still trying to save the woman I used to be, but she doesn't exist anymore. I don't need rescuing. I need to be seen and respected for who I've become. The distinction was profound, and Victor recognized his error immediately. You're right, he admitted. Elena moved toward the door, then paused. The wooden bird you left by the fountain. I found it when I returned to settle my father's estate. I've carried it with me ever since. She withdrew the small carving from her reticule, its wood polished smooth by years of handling. It reminded me during the worst times that somewhere, someone had seen me as worthy of careful attention. She placed the carving on his desk. Goodbye, Victor. After she left, Victor sat alone, turning the wooden bird over in his hands. He had thought this story ended with his failure and her sacrifice. But Elena had shown him that endings were often new beginnings in disguise. He set the carving on his desk, where he would see it daily, a reminder not of his failure, but of the woman who had taught him that authentic love sometimes meant letting go rather than holding on. In Madrid, Elena walked through her school's halls, checking on students learning that their minds mattered and their futures could be shaped by their own choices. The wooden bird remained in her classroom, a symbol not of lost love, but of recognition received and dignity claimed. Both had learned that some stories don't end with perfect resolution, but with the harder satisfaction of people becoming who they were meant to be. The authentic love Victor had sought had indeed been found, not in romantic fulfillment, but in the authentic recognition of another person's full humanity. And perhaps that was enough.